All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to go through some notes, and then at the end I'm going to give you a worksheet, and I want you to finish that worksheet for homework if you don't finish it in class, okay? So last time we talked a lot about some of the things that life has to do, right? It has to, let me see here, is it not letting me? There we go. We have to be able to maintain boundaries within our body. We have to be able to have movement and locomotion, and also movement of substances throughout the body, responsiveness, the ability to sense changes and react, digestion, break down things, right? Metabolism, which is the process of different chemical reactions that break down and build up things in our bodies, producing energy, all of that stuff, and excretion, the elimination of waste, reproduction, which is producing offspring for future generations, and growth, which is, getting larger, and development. These are all things that we have to do, and I think last time what we talked about in your class specifically was I wanted you to pair up and mention different body systems that we went over that may do each of these things, 2 for each one, okay? And we'll go over that when I come back next time. But I just wanted to move on to make sure that you have what you need to be able to do this worksheet, so that next time we're actually going to do a project associated with the things we're going to talk about a little bit later in this lecture. Okay. So what are the survival needs of a human being? What do we need in order to survive? Okay, so the first thing is we need nutrients. Nutrients are things like glucose and proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. All of those chemicals are needed to either create energy in our body or act as building blocks to build things and create molecules within our body. So nutrients are very important. The next thing you need is oxygen. Oxygen is something in us that, now not all living things need oxygen, but we absolutely need oxygen because we do cellular respiration. Oxygen is required to do those energy creating chemical reactions. And those chemical reactions obviously occur in the mitochondria. That's why it's called the powerhouse, because it creates ATP through cellular respiration. We need water. Water is, and we're going to have a whole mini unit kind of on water. We'll talk about that next week. But water is so important for life for a variety of different reasons. It acts as a nice intermediate to do chemical reactions in, and it doesn't really react with stuff. It moderates body temperature. So your whole entire body is made up of lots of water, because your body is basically a giant vat of chemical reactions. Okay, the stable body temperature relates to the water, but we have to be able to maintain that stable body temperature within us because we are warm-blooded or endotherms. Okay, and because our chemical reactions that do happen need to have a very narrow range of temperature in which they function properly in order to maintain us. That's why if you get a fever that's too high, right, which very rarely happens, but if your body temperature goes up a certain point, it'll actually kill you. If it gets too cold, it will kill you. So we have a very narrow range in which we can kind of survive in. One that's kind of weird, but atmospheric pressure for us needs to be appropriate. That has to do with a lot has to do with oxygen and gases in our blood. But if we go to, like, if you're in an airplane, right, you've heard of having a pressurized cabin. The reason they have to pressurize the cabin is because there's not enough air pressure up there. There's not enough oxygen in order to do what we need. The same thing can happen if you've ever gone diving. I don't know if any of you have gone diving before, but you have to have special training to go diving, not skydiving, but diving in the ocean. And that's because as you go down, you have to reach equilibrium with the pressure. So you have to kind of go down slowly. You also have to come back up slowly because the gases in your blood get used to a certain pressure that's deeper within the ocean. And if you go up too fast, it'll actually cause the gases in your blood to leave solution and go back into the atmosphere. It'll cause bubbles to form within your circulatory system, which can kill you. It's called the bends. Okay. So classic thing everyone's talked about, right, since we've probably been in grade school, homeostasis. What is homeostasis? And I think the definition of it is really interesting because it kind of is like when you hear the term dynamic equilibrium. The term dynamic means change, and the term equilibrium means stay the same. So the whole point of homeostasis, so it seems like an oxymoron, right? They're like opposites of each other. But what the point is that despite constant change within the body and in our external environments, we need to maintain sameness within ourselves. Okay? There's lots of different mechanisms for homeostasis. We're going to talk about a few of them in a second. But because all life needs homeostasis, we have a very narrow range of conditions in which life can be sustained. If that is thrown off, if we throw off homeostasis for any length of time and we cannot bring it back, that causes what's called a disease. Diseases can be caused by microorganisms, which are called infectious diseases, or viruses. They can be caused by improper functioning within ourselves because of a variety of reasons. It could be genetic, it could be environmental. Okay, anything that throws off homeostasis for any length or period of time is going to be considered a disease, until obviously you bring it back into homeostasis. We use things like different medications and things to bring it back if our bodies can't do it naturally, which is one of the reasons medicine has really extended the human lifespan compared to just 40 or 50 years ago, and especially compared to the 1800s and before that. So the way homeostasis works, you have some sort of variable. It can be anything within your body, right? And if it's thrown off balance, our goal is to get it back into balance, get it back to the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so you have a receptor that receives the information that it has gone out of balance. You have a control center, and that's usually in your brain, but it can be in other places too. That control center kind of decides a way we can bring it back into balance, and then it tells some effector to do something to bring it back to normal. Okay, that's the standard way homeostasis works. Now, there's two types of mechanisms that we usually use to maintain homeostasis, which we're going to go over in a second. Okay, so as I said, the receptor responds to the change, it recognizes the change, it receives that information, it then sends information to the control center being your brain. Okay, that determines the set point. That's going to be an important thing that I'm going to mention in a second. So it determines the point in which we should constantly be, and if we deviate from that, we should bring it back to that. Okay, and then it coordinates with the effector, which will then produce some means to bring us back to normal again. It'll do something within our body to bring it back to normal. It could be the release of a hormone. It could be causing sweat to be released. There's so many different things that it could be. Okay, so here this is again, just showing you again what I just showed you about a minute ago. So as I mentioned, there's really two ways we maintain homeostasis, and that's through feedback mechanisms. The first one and the most common one, and I think the easiest to understand in terms of how it maintains homeostasis, is a negative feedback mechanism or a negative feedback loop. The job of that is to shut off the original stimulus or reduce its intensity. So if you deviate from the set point, it tries to bring it back to the set point. Now, a common definition that the common definition, which is the one here, I think it creates misconceptions. Okay, so what I'm going to want you to write in your notes is another definition. Okay, because I think it's easier to know. As opposed to shuts off the original stimulus, because it seems like it's something rises and then brings it back down. It could also fall and bring it back up. So I think a more appropriate definition is, for negative feedback, set point. If you deviate from the set point, you bring it back to the set point. Okay, a thermostat's a great example. Okay, so think about your household thermostat, right? If it gets too hot, if you have air conditioning, right, the control center, right, or the thermostat will say that, oh, it's too hot. It'll then turn off the heater. That'll cause the room temperature to decrease. Or not only does it turn off the heater, it could turn on the air conditioning, right, to make it cooler. If it's too cold, what happens? The control center the thermostat tells your heater to turn on. It increases the room temperature by releasing heat. It brings it back to its set point. So in both cases, whether you deviate hot or cold, you're bringing it back to the set point. Your body does this too, right? You sweat when it gets too hot. That brings, due to evaporative cooling, brings your set point, or brings it back down to set point. If it gets too cold, you shiver and you generate heat that way, bringing it back up. There's other things that happen too, like when it's cold, the blood vessels in your extremities shut off. And that's why your hands and ears and feet get cold first, because your body tries to maintain its core temperature by sacrificing your hands and your feet, which they'll be fine in the short term unless it's really a long-term cold, and then you'll get things like frostbite, which is clearly a problem. But yeah, so your body tries to maintain that set point and deviate from that set point. If you do, you bring it back down to it. There's other examples like blood sugar regulation, where insulin's released when you eat sugar, which brings the blood sugar back down. Glucagon's released when it's too low to bring the blood sugar back up. Calcium is regulated this way. All different types of mechanisms are regulated through negative feedback, and we're going to talk about them throughout the course. There's also the positive feedback mechanism. So this one's a little bit more difficult to understand, but it still maintains homeostasis. And usually this is when you have like an unusual stimulus, like you don't have a set point necessarily. So think about having birthing a baby would be the best example of it. Okay, so what happens when you go into labor is the baby's head pushes on the back of the cervix. Okay, once the baby's big enough and in the proper position, that causes stretch receptors in the cervix to cause the brain, or the pituitary gland within the brain, specifically the posterior pituitary, to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then floods your blood stream, and it causes contractions of the uterus. Now if the uterus is contracting and pushing against the baby, that's going to cause the baby's head to hit more often, causing the stretch receptors to produce more oxytocin, which causes more contractions, more oxytocin, more contractions, until finally the baby is pushed out, and then it stops the process. The contractions stop. So notice it's amplifying the stimulus. So it says increases the original stimulus to push the variable further. My definition that I want you to write down that's different from this is amplification to completion, right? You're going to amplify, increase that stimulus until it finally is done. And then once the baby's born, the baby's head's no longer pushing on the cervix, the body kind of goes back to normal again. Blood clotting is another example of this as well. Blood clotting factors actually activate more blood clotting factors, causing blood clotting to accelerate until finally the blood clot forms. So here's showing you that example I just gave. There's the baby's head pushing on the cervix, on the bottom of the uterus, causing the stretch receptors to stimulate the brain to release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes the uterus to contract, more baby's head pushing on the cervix, more stretching, more oxytocin, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is really what I wanted to get to today. Obviously, that stuff before that is important, but this is going to relate to a project we're going to do next class, and this is the language of anatomy. So this is stuff you probably have never heard before. It's completely unique to anatomy. They don't talk about it in AP Bio. They don't talk about it in any freshman level class. So this is terminology that we use to understand things like position, direction, different regions of the body, different structures of the body. So the first thing we're going to focus on are the orientation and directional terms that you have to know, okay? So the first thing is superior. Now these are relationships to each other. So when we talk about one part of the body to another. Now superior is referring to the bottom of your body to the top. Things that are superior are above. Things that are inferior are below. So if I talk about like my nose and my chin, right? My nose is superior to my chin because it's above my chin. My chin is inferior to my nose because it is below my nose. Okay? So that's how you would use that. So it's referring to things in the plane up and down in this direction. Okay. Another term for that would be cranial, towards the head. So your nose is, well, let's say your chin is cranial to your chest because it's above it, or cephalad. Both cephalad and cranial really mean towards the head. Okay. Another term for inferior is also caudal. They're different names for each other. You're going to have a quiz on this stuff next week at some point, probably towards the end of it. I want you to know that cranial and caudal are different terms for superior and inferior. Okay, so make sure you remember that. If we're moving in this plane now towards the front and the back of the body, right, we have anterior and posterior. Anterior means towards the front of the body. Posterior means towards the back. Now again, we have two other words that we can use here, ventral and dorsal. Ventral also means towards the front. Dorsal also means towards the back. Okay, you've heard of like a dorsal fin on a dolphin or a shark or something like that, right? It's in the back of their body. So you would say something like your nose is anterior to your ears, right? Because in this plane, your nose is more forward compared to your ears. Okay, your spine is posterior to your chest because it's behind it, or it's dorsal to your chest. Now you can see how the differences in use, right? Dorsal and posterior surface are the same in humans, but that may not be the case in animals because of how they orient themselves in space. But because we stand upright, superior and inferior are similar to cranial and caudal, and anterior and posterior are similar to dorsal and ventral. All right, this one's a little bit more complicated. This is medial. Medial means towards the midline of the body. So imagine, right, we are bilaterally symmetric for the most part. It's not perfect, but we're close, where we have a line of symmetry down the center of our bodies. And the midline is a line drawn directly down the middle of the body. Medial means towards the midline, whereas lateral means away from the midline. So you would say something like, so if I'm standing in what's called anatomical position, which we'll talk, I don't even know if you can see me like this, stand up, and then hopefully you'll see my hands, right? Anatomical position is standing facing forward with your arms out and your palms facing forward, always. It gives us a reference point in which we can always use these terms, because that would change if I was actually standing like this. Like, for example, my thumb is lateral to my pinky because it's further from the midline from my pinky in anatomical position. Well, if I was standing like this, the opposite is true. We have to assume that we are always in anatomical position for a reference point. Okay. So my thumb would be lateral to my pinky. My pinky is medial to my thumb. It's closer to the midline. You could even say the same thing. Your elbow is lateral to your chest. Your chest is medial to your elbow. Closer to the midline, medial, further away from the midline, lateral. Okay? Intermediate is when you're talking in the medial lateral plane, but you're talking about two things that are intermediate, but like something is between one object and another, or one body part and another in that lateral to medial plane. Your armpit is intermediate between your pinky and your chest. Okay, so that's when you'd use the term intermediate. I think this one, students have the most difficulty with this one, which is proximal, and the other one, which isn't shown here, is distal, D-I-S-T-E, or T-A-L. Proximal means closer to the point of insertion of a body part. So if we're looking at my arm, for example, the point of insertion of my arm is up here. So when we're going to be talking about the plane in this direction, away from the point of insertion. If it's my legs, it's talking about like where my hip inserts into my pelvis all the way down to my foot. So if we're looking at my arm, my elbow is proximal to my wrist. That's because the elbow is closer to the point of insertion of this limb than my wrist is. Whereas my wrist is distal. Think like distance, that's how you can remember it. My wrist is distal to my elbow. It's further away from the point of insertion. Okay, and you can do it here too. You can do it like if this part of my wrist is the point of insertion. My palm is the palm of my hand is proximal to my middle finger. It's closer to the point of insertion compared to my middle finger. Okay, so that's the proximal and distal relationship. Okay, and then there's two more that I want you to know. Now, normally if I'm in class, I perform all this stuff, and I can't do this right now. But the other two are prone and supine. So prone means to lie face down on the ground. Okay, or like if a doctor says to a nurse and someone's under anesthetic, I want the patient prone on the bed, right? That means lying face down, posterior side up. Okay, where if they say I want them supine, supine's the opposite. That means lying face up on the bed. Okay, so prone, face down, supine, face up. Prone also means, like, if you've ever heard, like, I don't know, any of your like first-person shooter gamers, okay, or like in the Army, Prone means lying on your stomach and pointing your gun this way because basically it makes you less of a target. It's harder to hit you. You're very small. Okay. Lying face down, prone, lying face up, supine. There's also a bunch of body landmarks. I'm not gonna worry too much about these. You'll hear us talk about them in different words like thoracic, meaning lungs, and cervical relates to your neck. All stuff we'll talk about as we go through. Okay, but I'm not going to worry about this right now, but just be aware that there are different body locations and landmarks, and they're named for a lot of times the body parts that are around them. Here are the posterior body landmarks here. Some of them are obvious, like gluteal. You know, this is the gluteus maximus, right? Your gluteal would be towards the your posterior on your rear end, essentially. Lumbar, that's the lower part of your back. Sacral, where your sacrum would be. And the last thing I want to talk about are body planes. Okay, so body planes split your body into symmetric halves somewhat. Like, I shouldn't say symmetric, because the only one really that does that is the mid-sagittal plane, which goes directly down the middle. So the mid-sagittal plane would split your body right down that midline that we talked about earlier with medial and lateral. It splits it down that midline into two symmetric halves. Okay, so mid-sagittal plane would be that. If I'm talking about a frontal plane, that splits you into anterior and posterior halves, as you can see there in B. And then there's the transverse plane, which splits your body in half, like in this direction. So it splits you into inferior and superior halves in that case. And a lot of this relates more to talking about things like views of body systems when looking at different planes within the body, like on MRI scans and things. So you can see, oh, I want a sagittal plane. Well, if it's a sagittal plane, you're going to see it, you know, the body split in half this way. You're going to see the plane of the image in that direction. Whereas you can see you get a different viewpoint if you were to even look at the brain with a frontal plane. It would go down this way, but you can see the whole middle part of the body here. There's the lungs, the heart, and the liver and intestines here. And then the transverse plane gives you another image, which splits you in this direction, up and down. Okay, so different body planes, different terms used to split the body in different ways. And then there's the body cavities. So we have, and I want you to know these individually, we have our thoracic cavity here. That's where your lungs and heart would be found. Okay, that is a ventral or an anterior body cavity. It's in the front. We have our cranial cavity. That's where our brain would sit. That's more of a dorsal body cavity, they consider it, even though it's kind of in the middle. The same thing's true with the spinal cavity. That's also a dorsal body cavity. That's where your spinal cord sits in there. Then we have the pelvic cavity and the abdominal cavity, which many times would be together, right, into the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is where you have most of your digestive tract and parts of your urinary system, your kidneys, things like that. Then you have the pelvic cavity, which has your reproductive organs and part of the urinary system as well. Okay, so thoracic, heart and lungs, abdominal, digestive tract, parts of your urinary system, pelvic cavity, reproductive and urinary systems, spinal cord, cranial, brain. And that's it. That's all I have for you guys today. So please now finish that worksheet up. If you can't finish it in class, please finish it for homework, and I will see you next class.